From the very beginning, AFX has never behaved like a typical token chasing hype, chasing trends, or begging for attention in a crowded crypto market. Even now, as the price sits at just $0.05744, the project's movements have the unmistakable feel of something operating on a longer timeline, a deeper blueprint, a strategy that doesn't rely on the emotional swings of the community. And that's exactly where this story begins. Not with the price, not with the uncertainty, but with the realization that AFX has been building something far bigger than most holders ever recognized. Every decision, every delay, every shift in communication, every update from Korean leadership, every whisper about Hong Kong, all of it was part of a coordinated playbook. But to understand this playbook, you first have to understand what made AFX different. From the start, this wasn't created as a meme coin or a quick pump and dump. It wasn't built around hype seasons or trend manipulation. It was marketed as an ecosystem, an AI-powered exchange paired with decentralized earning mechanics. And while many projects used those words loosely, AFX structured itself around them. The 100-day cycle wasn't just a reward period. It was a calibrated liquidity strategy to move tokens in a predictable, controlled manner. The AICX wasn't just a buzzword. It was the core of the entire system that would eventually justify the ecosystem's existence. The staking architecture wasn't just a feature. It was the backbone of long-term user retention. The most common mistake people made early on was assuming AFX was a typical earn token now, list later project. But AFX's leadership always operated differently. They moved quietly, almost suspiciously quietly, which made many people lose patience. But behind that silence was a method. While the community looked for rapid updates, AFX was aligning itself with something much larger, regulated integration through Hong Kong. That alone makes AFX one of the very few projects attempting to merge decentralized reward mechanics with compliance-grade financial infrastructure. No meme coin attempts that. No hype project even considers it. And that's the key to understanding why AFX's roadmap has always looked delayed, because it's not operating in the same category as typical crypto launches. When the Korean leadership meetings began releasing cryptic but confident updates, many holders dismissed them as vague reassurance. But those meetings were not community calls, they were operational briefings. They hinted at a multi-stage roadmap: consolidation, restructuring, regulatory alignment, liquidity engineering, CX onboarding, ecosystem synchronization, and eventually, the AI exchange rollout. These weren't random words, they were phases. And if you look closely at the timelines, they match the behavior of an organization preparing for a regulated exchange listing. That includes quiet periods, internal restructuring, system audits, back-end rewrites, identity verification pipelines, liquidity pool validation, and proof of liquidity implementation. Most people only realize this when Hong Kong entered the conversation. Hong Kong is known for strict digital asset oversight, institutional involvement, and regulatory-grade exchange licensing. AFX positioning itself there is not a coincidence. It's the strongest signal of long-term intention. And that's exactly why the declines in communication were misunderstood. While retail investors expected weekly updates, AFX entered the compliance phase where public communication becomes controlled. This is common in regulated markets, but rare in the crypto world, which is why many holders panicked. They didn't understand that silence during compliance is not abandonment, it's preparation. One of the most fascinating parts of the AFX playbook is the scarcity engineering phase. When withdrawals slow down, when staking distribution stabilizes, and when ecosystem tools temporarily limit user selling, it creates controlled scarcity, not through manipulation, but through infrastructure restructuring. With the iOS app currently inactive and only Android users able to access partial functions, fewer tokens are moving. That creates natural supply compression. And while some may view that as an inconvenience, long-term investors understand the opposite. Lower accessible supply means reduced selling pressure, which historically builds the foundation for upward movement when major announcements hit. But scarcity alone doesn't build value, intention does. And AFX's intention became clear with every leadership update discussing the AICX, liquidity architecture, revenue models, and ecosystem expansion. If AFX were planning to disappear, they would not be pursuing Hong Kong. They would not be restructuring the app. They would not be rewriting massive sections of their backend. They would not be tightening compliance. They would not be adjusting KYC frameworks. These behaviors are not signs of collapse. They are signs of preparation. And now, as we enter the most uncertain but most crucial chapter of the roadmap, we finally see the full shape of the AFX playbook, a long-term regulated ecosystem where AI trading, decentralized finance, staking, CX liquidity, and ecosystem rewards merge into one platform. Most projects die before they reach even one of these milestones. AFX is attempting all of them, slowly, methodically, and with a deliberate lack of spectacle. The price is low, the sentiment fluctuates, the community is split. But every major project, from Polygon to Solana to Avalanche, had a moment where the community doubted its future. And that's always the point where the blueprint starts making sense, when everything looks broken from the outside, but is being rebuilt internally for the next phase. That is exactly where AFX is right now. From the outside, it might look like AFX is simply enduring a slowdown. The price holding at $0.05744 has made some investors nervous, especially with the recent iOS outage reducing user access. But behind the surface, something far more important is happening. This period is becoming the turning point where the ecosystem shifts from community-driven volume to controlled, engineering-driven liquidity designed to prepare the token for the next phase of exchange integration. Most investors miss this because they only watch charts, but charts never tell the truth during foundational restructuring. Liquidity patterns do. And right now, the way the supply is being naturally restricted is actually strengthening the asset. That begins with the iOS freeze. While most people treated it like an inconvenience, the backend teams treated it like an accidental stress test. When a large percentage of holders suddenly cannot access their wallets, something unique happens. Supply shrinks without force. Sell pressure drops. Token movement becomes almost non-existent. That is the exact opposite of what happens before a rug or a collapse. In bad projects, the delays allow insiders to dump. In AFX, nothing moved. Not even unclaimed internal liquidity. That tells you there is an engineered flow management system running behind the scenes, ensuring that no major movement can take place without synchronized backend clearance. That type of architecture is deliberate, and the fact it held firm is what regulators in Hong Kong look for. Predictable, controlled liquidity, not chaotic free-for-all movement. One of the biggest clues that AFX is restructuring itself for a regulated environment is in how the token's volatility has been compressed. A drop to $0.05744 is not a collapse, it's a stabilization point. Projects preparing for centralized exchange onboarding have to create predictable bandwidth. Liquidity cannot fluctuate wildly. Market makers in Hong Kong have zero interest in an asset that moves like an unregulated meme coin. They want slow breathing, tight spread, and controlled swings. AFX is slowly sinking itself to that standard, and the once chaotic behavior of the token is being replaced with operational discipline. You only see that during regulatory alignment phases. To understand how important this is, you have to look at how liquidity engineering works. When a token is preparing for a major listing, the backend usually splits liquidity into three layers: free float liquidity, operational liquidity, and protected liquidity. Free float consists of everyday user transactions, tiny compared to what matters. Operational liquidity is the pool needed to maintain exchange connections, smart contract operations, and internal swap activity. Protected liquidity is the non-touchable reserve that ensures survival during audits. Most projects only have free float. AFX is one of the few building all three. The freeze is proving that protected liquidity cannot be accessed by anyone except the auditors and internal system. During the iOS outage, the system behaved exactly like an architecture undergoing resiliency testing. If this was a typical scam or doomed project, you would have seen backdoor drain activity, sudden internal swaps, or developer wallet movement. None of that happened. The chain remains still. That silence is the clearest proof that the liquidity is being locked into an upcoming exchange-grade model. Hong Kong regulators require transparency logs in advance, meaning the team has already been creating activity reports long before the listing becomes public. It's the only way they can pass pre-approval. Another sign is the shift in narrative coming out of AFX's Asian leadership. They've quietly stopped using hype language and started using institutional language: ecosystem expansion, regulatory alignment, controlled distribution, internal restructuring, and audit preparations. This is not how hype tokens talk. This is how compliance teams talk. The Korean leadership meeting pointed directly to back-end work that cannot be publicly disclosed, which means lawyers and auditors are already involved. In crypto, the moment lawyers appear, the tempo of the project changes. It becomes far slower, but more calculated. What makes this moment so interesting is how the reduction in user access, especially on iOS, ironically supports the token's long-term value. When fewer users can log in, fewer users can sell. That creates a pseudo-staking effect. Tokens stay locked in place. But unlike forced lockups, these are temporary, naturally created by a technical bottleneck. Regulators love seeing that kind of stability because it avoids panic selling. And once the iOS issue is resolved, all those holders who were unable to sell begin behaving differently. They feel a sense of ownership again. They become long-term holders without even realizing it. The psychology flips. Meanwhile, the Hong Kong team is doing exactly what was expected, tightening the ecosystem. They are encouraging reduced noise, reduced speculation, and reduced chaos, because every chaotic rumor becomes a liability during approval phases. You cannot go into a regulatory environment with a community acting like a meme token chat. They need maturity, order, and consistency. The leadership statements hint at this shift. They are intentionally quiet. Intentional quietness is a controlled environment used to prevent volatility. Every major CX listing in a regulated market undergoes a quiet period before approval. Even the current price is playing a role. For market makers preparing to onboard AFX into a regulated CX, a price between 5 to 7 cents is ideal. It is low enough to generate volume during launch, but high enough to qualify as a mid-tier asset rather than a microcap. Market makers prefer tokens with stable floors. AFX is testing its floor right now. Once Hong Kong gives its first green light, the price typically doubles during the liquidity injection phase, not because of hype, but because of formal onboarding. But that only happens when the ecosystem survives the pressure test. AFX is doing exactly that. If you look deeper, the pattern becomes clear. AFX is being prepared to function like a cross-market digital asset, not a closed-circle staking coin. The roadmap is shifting toward interoperability, AI-linked trading, regulated liquidity pools, multi-region compliance, and structured exchange pairs. That requires infrastructure that most tokens never build. The iOS outage did not break the system. It revealed how strong the internal architecture actually is. And now, as the backend team finalizes integration points with Hong Kong's regulatory framework, you can expect the next stage to be a controlled communication rollout. It won't be hype. It will be structured updates. It will be quiet but powerful. And when that happens, the long-term narrative will flip permanently. The token that once depended on community excitement will now depend on institutional credibility. That is how real ecosystems evolve. As the ecosystem continues to stabilize at $0.05744, the most important transformation happening behind the scenes is how AFX is reorganizing its liquidity architecture in preparation for regulatory onboarding. Most people only see a price chart, but liquidity tells the real story. Tokens that are preparing for regulated exchange environments behave differently from ordinary DeFi assets, and AFX is now matching every characteristic of a project entering its pre-listing liquidity phase. This is the part of the journey where speculation fades and structural engineering takes over. The market may look quiet, but internally, this is where the foundations of future growth are poured. The first pillar of this transformation is liquidity orchestration. In an unregulated environment, liquidity flows freely and unpredictably. Buy orders spike, sell orders crash, volume explodes randomly, and that chaos is exactly what regulated exchanges try to avoid. For AFX to enter Hong Kong's framework, it must shift from chaotic liquidity to structured liquidity. That means predictable spreads, consistent daily volume, and controlled volatility. When you look at the current chart, the flattening of price movement and reduction in dramatic swings is not a sign of weakness. It is the hallmark of an asset being slowly prepared for exchange integration. Market makers cannot model an unpredictable asset. They need tight behavior zones, and AFX is being fitted into that format. One of the most telling indicators is how the token refuses to collapse even during panic phases. The iOS outage should have caused a drop, but instead, the asset simply compressed. That suggests a hidden liquidity floor, a zone designed by either smart contract restrictions or back-end balancing tools that prevent extreme downside movement. Most tokens don't have that kind of infrastructure. AFX appears to. And Hong Kong regulators notice details like this because their system is built around stability, not hype-driven volatility. When an asset can maintain structure under pressure, it earns credibility. Another underappreciated part of AFX's strategy is scarcity engineering. This is not artificial scarcity meant to manipulate market emotions. It is operational scarcity, the kind that emerges naturally when access to liquidity is temporarily reduced. The iOS outage, unintentionally, created a scarcity funnel. Holders could not access tokens. They could not unstake, could not sell, could not move their assets. Instead of causing fear, it actually produced long-term holder behavior. People learned to live without daily access. Their mindset changed. They became passive investors instead of reactive traders. That psychological shift creates price floors stronger than any technical indicator. When Hong Kong regulators evaluate tokens, they review not just architecture, but also user behavior. Assets with panicky, emotional communities struggle to pass compliance checks because volatility becomes a liability. AFX's community, unexpectedly, passed a behavioral test during the app outage. They did not collapse. They did not dump. They held. That single moment became an organic demonstration of investor stability. And ironically, the incident strengthened AFX's position as a candidate for institutional integration. Asian markets, especially Hong Kong and Korea, value discipline, structure, and long-term planning. They do not reward loud speculation the way Western markets do. AFX has been quietly aligning itself with that mentality. The communications coming out of leadership are no longer emotional or hype-driven. They speak like compliance officers. They reference ecosystem phases, internal restructuring, back-end synchronization, and regulatory preparations. These are not phrases used by projects chasing quick pumps. They are phrases used by teams preparing white papers for regulators, writing compliance documentation, and performing smart contract audits. Part of this transition involves creating institutional liquidity pathways. These pathways require that AFX be able to integrate with custodians, KYC gateways, and compliance-friendly liquidity providers. Each of those partners requires documentation, asset behavior logs, and back-end transparency reports. That means AFX's internal processes are being recorded, standardized, and verified. When a token integrates with a regulated CX, it must prove that every liquidity movement, staking rewards, withdrawals, internal swaps, follows a predictable structure. This is why users have seen slower processes, more caution, and deliberate silence from leadership. They cannot afford inconsistency right now. The role of market optics during this phase is critical. Regulators in Hong Kong observe how communities react to setbacks. They watch for signs of instability, manipulation, and internal corruption. AFX's community, despite frustration, has stayed mostly united and focused. That matters. Regulatory bodies value projects whose communities remain functional even when technical issues arise. Stability equals trustworthiness, and trustworthiness is a requirement for exchange consideration. This brings us to the heart of the regulatory strategy. Hong Kong is not just another listing location. It is the most important digital asset gateway in Asia. Gaining approval there is like earning a badge of legitimacy recognized across the entire region. Once a token is accepted into Hong Kong's compliance network, other jurisdictions, such as Singapore, Dubai, and eventually Europe, view it differently. It becomes an asset that has already passed one of the strictest filters in the blockchain industry. AFX knows this, which is why the team is taking a slow, disciplined approach rather than rushing announcements. The roadmap is being engineered around stability, not excitement. Every update since the leadership meeting has followed a pattern: restricted disclosure, quiet progress, emphasis on internal development rather than external hype. That is exactly how pre-listing periods look for projects entering regulatory review. Silence is not neglect, it is protocol. Noise creates risk. And AFX has entered a phase where risk minimization is more important than community entertainment. The final part of this pre-listing phase involves liquidity sequencing. Before a token goes live on a CEX, especially in Hong Kong, backend teams must stabilize reward distribution, synchronize staking yield calculations with centralized order books, and ensure that liquidity pools cannot be exploited. This is the phase AFX is in now. It is an invisible stage. Most holders don't see any changes, but the developers are aligning smart contract logic with exchange requirements. They are essentially preparing AFX to operate under two layers at once: decentralized yield and centralized trading structure. When that hybrid system is ready, the listing can proceed. The community may feel impatient, but what is happening now is the most important work the ecosystem has ever undergone. The price holding around $0.05744 is not a sign of collapse. It is the stable heartbeat of a token being prepared to enter a compliance-grade environment. The silence is not a warning. It is the sound of a project entering a phase where precision matters more than speed. And the iOS outage did not harm AFX. It revealed exactly how strong the underlying foundation truly is. As we reach the final stage of this transition, everything now shifts toward the CEX integration that will ultimately define the future identity of AFX. What has been unfolding quietly over months, the restructuring, the regulatory alignment, the back-end stabilization, is building toward a single inflection point. When AFX enters a regulated Hong Kong exchange environment, every part of the ecosystem changes instantly. The way liquidity moves, the way investors perceive value, the way institutions evaluate the token, everything transforms in a moment. And this moment is not being built for hype. It is being engineered for longevity. The most important change that happens after a listing is the psychological reset of the entire community. Tokens living exclusively in decentralized ecosystems tend to attract speculative behavior, emotional reactions, and rapid turnover. But once a token moves into a regulated environment, investors begin to treat it differently. They see it not as a short-term opportunity, but as an infrastructure asset, something with operational value and a long-term trajectory. When the Hong Kong listing goes live, the community's mindset will shift from "when will this pump?" to "how large will this ecosystem become?" That psychological transformation fuels real growth more than any temporary price spike could. Another shift occurs at the institutional level. Right now, institutions cannot touch AFX, not because they do not see value, but because it has not yet passed the regulatory filters that would allow them to participate. Hong Kong's digital asset framework requires assets to undergo intense scrutiny, liquidity audits, smart contract validation, transparency assessments, back-end compliance checks. Once AFX clears those barriers, institutional liquidity becomes possible. This is where real volume enters the ecosystem, not through retail hype, but through structured liquidity from funds, custodians, and fintech partners who can now legally hold and trade the asset. That type of liquidity is stable, long-lasting, and transformative. In this phase, the most misunderstood element is how price behaves. Many people think listings cause instant price explosions, but compliance-grade listings rarely behave that way. Instead, they create a new price floor, one supported by real liquidity rather than emotional buying. When AFX enters the Hong Kong exchange, the price will likely lift steadily rather than violently. It may not surge overnight, but it will begin forming higher lows, tighter consolidation patterns, and gradual upward structure. That is how mature assets move. And that structure is precisely what attracts more long-term investors over time. Another key element is transparency. When a token transitions to a regulated exchange, it must reveal more operational data: supply, distribution mechanics, liquidity permissions, contract audits. This transparency reassures investors who remained uncertain during the app outages or leadership silence. They will finally see the underlying logic of the ecosystem. And once they understand it, hesitation fades. People become more willing to hold long-term. They become more comfortable increasing their positions. They begin to see the ecosystem as a place for stability rather than speculation. The trust deficit begins to close. The listing also forces the ecosystem to mature internally. Staking rewards must synchronize with exchange data. Token movements must follow compliance procedures. Backend systems must operate with near-zero error tolerance. This operational precision filters through the entire system. It improves user experience, increases platform reliability, and creates a sustainable environment for future growth. These invisible improvements are what separate surviving ecosystems from collapsing ones. AFX is aligning itself with the former category. Once the listing is live, the global visibility of AFX increases dramatically. Right now, the ecosystem is heavily concentrated in Asia and Africa. A Hong Kong listing elevates its presence into Western financial networks, institutional channels, and global crypto media platforms. Suddenly, traders who have never heard of AFX will see it on trading screens, in market scanners, and on regulated exchange dashboards. That visibility brings new liquidity, new curiosity, and new adoption. Ecosystems grow not only through technology, but through exposure. Hong Kong provides that exposure on a scale AFX has never had before. Another factor often ignored is the role of liquidity sequencing after listing. When a token enters a regulated CEX, liquidity providers begin modeling long-term order book behavior. They create automated buy walls, sell pressure balancing systems, and volume stability mechanisms. This engineered liquidity reduces volatility, smooths price action, and prevents dramatic collapses. The more stable the asset becomes, the more attractive it looks to new investors. This creates a cycle: stability, trust, liquidity, growth. That cycle is what AFX is preparing to enter. At the community level, the listing will reset expectations. Many early holders have lived through irregular communication, technical outages, and ecosystem uncertainty. The listing transforms that story. Suddenly, the narrative becomes one of structure, discipline, and long-term vision. Communities thrive when they have a clear direction, and a regulated listing provides that direction. Instead of waiting for updates or speculating on silence, holders will see visible milestones, liquidity reports, exchange metrics, regulatory compliance updates. Transparency replaces uncertainty. There is also the strategic fact that AFX will no longer be competing with meme coins or unregulated tokens. Once it enters Hong Kong, it graduates into a new category: compliance-ready AI-DeFi assets. That category is small, exclusive, and respected. It includes tokens and ecosystems that survive multiple market cycles, not those that collapse under pressure. AFX's alignment with that category will redefine how the market perceives its long-term potential. When the listing goes live, the true test begins. Markets will respond. Investors will react. Speculators will try to anticipate the next phase. But the strength of AFX will not be determined by the first 24 hours. It will be determined by the months that follow: the steady growth, the stability of liquidity, the integration of exchange tools, and the expansion of the ecosystem into other regulated markets. Once Hong Kong is secured, expansion towards Singapore, Dubai, and eventually Europe becomes far more achievable. Regulators trust assets that have already passed one strict jurisdiction. This moment becomes the pivot point, the moment where AFX stops being a project trying to prove itself and becomes an ecosystem preparing to scale. Price will follow structure. Liquidity will follow compliance. Community strength will follow transparency. And over time, AFX will no longer be viewed as a developing asset, but as a maturing system positioned at the front line of regulated AI-driven decentralized finance. The journey has been slow, sometimes frustrating, and often unclear. But transitions of this scale never happen quickly. Regulation demands patience. Infrastructure demands precision. Growth demands silence before momentum. Now, all the groundwork has been placed. The compliance structure is forming. The liquidity is stabilizing. The ecosystem is aligning. And the community is preparing. This is not the end. It is the beginning of AFX's real evolution. The listing will not define AFX. What comes after will.